You can grab some coffee, you can grab breakfast. The sound is reaching the other room. We are going to start with our panel. We're going to have a discussion, actually. I very briefly will introduce the speakers of this panel, who you all know. Professor Starr, who is the founding chairman of the Central Asia Caucus Institute here in Washington. He is a distinguished fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council. He has a storied life and research. You can move to this one. Yeah, of research and writing books. And I'm not going to list them all because there are a lot and they are fundamental. I will just say something interesting that probably not everybody knows. He's also a founding member of the Louisiana Repertory Jazz Ensemble of New Orleans and founder of the foundation that was helping recovery after Katrina. And something to know about him. He's written books about New Orleans too, and he is a musician himself. Along with all the serious books on Central Asia and other parts that he has written. Ilya Ponomaryov is a politician and technology entrepreneur. He was member of the Russian parliament. He left the Russian Duma when Russia attacked Ukraine in 2014. He lives in Ukraine now, and he is doing incredible work to foster the resistance to the Russian regime, to the Putin's regime. And Janusz Bugajski is a senior fellow at the Jamestown Foundation. He has written 24 books, I believe, on Europe, the Balkans, Caucasus, and Russia. His latest two books, one is Failed State, a Guide to Russia's Rupture, and the next one is Pivotal Poland, the rising power of Europe. So actually, I have to mention the last book, and I hope that you got copies here. This is an anthology of the Free Nations, and we're going to give some of the books today to our panelists and to other participants here. Just arrived yesterday from the printing house in London. It is a compilation of all the work that the Free Nations of post-Russia has done. All the speeches, all the presentations are there in this book. And Paul Goebel, who is already online, he is a longtime specialist on ethnic and religious questions in Eurasia. If you want to talk about nationalities in the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation and the entire space that was occupied first by the Russian Empire and then by the Soviet Union, Paul Goebel is probably the mentor of everybody who knows anything about nationalities. He's a senior fellow at Jamestown Foundation as well. So full bios are online, you can see them. Welcome to my participants here. And let's start with our first question, which is the most important one. And the question is, how strong is Russia now? How strong is the Russian state given its war losses, its economic destruction, and the financial downturn? And I don't know who would like to answer first. I'm not going to be able to see Paul Goebel, but let's start with Paul Goebel, and then we'll move around the panel.
There's no question that Russia is a weakened state because of its choice to invade Ukraine. There's also no question that Russia is on a long-term decline. Whether that will lead to disintegration or what will succeed it is certainly unclear. And those of us in the West are going to be dealing with another problem, not of the last century, but of the century before. This is going to be the Eastern question, the management of the decline and likely breakout of the Russian Empire. How that will happen will depend in large measure not just on the non-Russian part of the population, but the Russian part of the population, which is extraordinarily divided, on Moscow's interest, and on the West, which is divided now between those who see the continued existence of the Russian Federation as important as a bulwark against a rising China, and those who believe that only if Russia comes apart, if the empire comes apart, will there be any chance for peace in the future. That debate's going to continue for some time. I think it's important that I would just make three quick points. First, the decline of Russia is across the board. It's not one thing. It's economic, it's demographic, it's ideological, and all of those things have gotten significantly worse in the last decade. Second, the West is going to have to make some fundamental choices, but it's also going to have to learn to focus on more than replaying 1991. What's coming isn't going to look like 1991, and it's going to be a big challenge because most people who talk about the coming demise or disintegration of the Russian Federation talk only in terms of the 1991 model. And the third, and I think this is the most important point of all, and it's one that we didn't learn after 91, but we certainly should be learning now. The question is not only achieving the dismemberment of the Russian Empire, but ensuring that it stays dismembered. What we're seeing in Ukraine is an effort to reverse that process. And unless we're going to be, if we believe that the end of the Russian Empire is the only way forward toward a more peaceful world, then we're going to have to be worried not only how do we get there, but how do we make sure that there aren't going to be forces that are going to reverse that. That discussion hasn't really begun, and yet it should be at the top of the list of things to worry about given what's happening in Ukraine.
Thank you, Paul. I will turn now to Professor Starr about the scenarios for Russia. He has written a very interesting article about the history of power transition in Russia, which is available on the information table and was distributed today among the participants. And I found his thoughts very, very intriguing. What kind of transition Russia has had historically, and what could we expect now? What kind of scenarios we could expect now? Thank you.
First of all, there's no point in engaging in speculative globe spinning. We don't know what's going to happen. That's the nature of life. However, I think with regard to Russia's long-term evolution, one can be very precise. There are two great engines of fundamental change. One is generational shift, and the other is defeat militarily. There are only two. Let me say a word about each of them. On the generational front, the current leadership in Moscow is older than the Politburo was in 91. It's a single generation. Mr. Belousov, who appeared, by the way, in the Great Parade in a business suit, can you imagine what a humiliation that was? That the head of the military, the Secretary of Defense appears in civilian garb in a parade, and you could see the eyebrows go up of the old guard as they observe this. But he and that generation, they've known each other for 30 years, and they've advanced as a team, and they've done a poor job of recruiting young people. Why? Because why do we need to? So that generation is now long in the tooth. And just as is happening today in Turkey, and just as happening in many other countries, this is going to drive change. And the sheer depth of the difference between the outgoing generation and the rising generation is a polarizing fact. And therefore, the younger people, men and women, across the country, educated and uneducated, are going to be, and are already, there's plenty of evidence for this, that much more keen to separate themselves, separate their aspirations from those of their fathers and grandfathers. So this is a fact. Now, the second reality is military, and I don't need to go into all this. You all know it very well, and Paul Goebel has already spoken about it. But what has happened in Russia is a profound defeat, no matter what happens henceforth and militarily. It's already happened. And this has very profound long-term implications. How? Yes, he's converted the entire industrial base to military production. That's fine. Those companies are being paid. They're being paid out of the rainy day fund, which is going to, several people whom I respect, economists, tell me that rainy day fund is going to dry up by the end of this year. But those companies that are manufacturing, because they were retooled for military production, the men and women running those firms know very well that it will take years and vast amounts of money to convert back. This is a formidable reality, and it's totally undiscussed. And other factors of this defeat are equally glossed over. The fact that so much money has been diverted to military means that you have a vast sum of deferred maintenance around the country. You see it everywhere. It's a reality. Listen to the governors in the Duma. These guys are very, very blunt these days. And they're talking about deferred maintenance. We're collapsing, basically, is the message. And they're taking off their gloves. They're mentioning names now. They weren't doing that 6 months ago. So this defeat is not something prospective. It is already happening. It has happened. These are unavoidable realities, and no instant or short-term success on the battlefield will change them. Russia has been defeated in this war. It's been disastrous, and therefore these two factors both come together and drive fundamental change. Now, I'm not going to speculate on the rising generation or how they're going to retool and reorganize afterwards. But I want to make a few historical points before concluding. First of all, take the long history. There have been periods of remarkable reform in Russia. Curiously, one of the most important occurred after the Crimean War of the 1850s. What happened? Well, interestingly, just as with Putin, Nicholas I, who was called Nicholas Palkin, Nick the Stick, Nicholas I failed to invest in rifled guns and rifles, and he failed to invest in railroads. So he could neither get his troops to Crimea, nor could they fight successfully against the French, the British, and the Piedmontese. We forget they were there. And they lost disastrously. Now, interestingly, that was a generation too. And that entire generation of Nick the Stick was out in 1856, absolutely out. He conveniently died. But even had that not happened, the generational shift was immediate and profound, and very talented people emerged. I won't go into all their names. New Minister of Defense, new Foreign Minister of Foreign Affairs. All of these were new people. They were all younger people. They were all pro-reform, and they did wonderful things for almost for 6-7 years. And what did they achieve? They emancipated 90% of the population from serfdom 2 years before Abraham Lincoln did in America. They created elective local assemblies, absolutely unheard of during Nicholas' time or any time previously in Russia. Elective local assemblies that Tolstoy, Chekhov, both were honored to participate in these local zemstvas, as they were called. They also created a totally new legal system, borrowed heavily from Germany, and quite successfully, I have to say. It goes on and on. Military reform, abolishing 25-year service, all that, increasing training, all sorts of good things happened. Of course, why did it come apart? It came apart because they refused, Alexander II refused to apply these same reforms to Poland. And the Poles revolted, and that put an end to the reform movement. But my point is this. This was a profound period of change that was driven by military defeat and was led by a completely new generation of people who were quite unknown prior to the defeat. Now, you don't have to have a change at the top. The defeat of Tsarist Russia by the Japanese in 1905 was extremely important. It led directly to the establishment of an elective national assembly, the Duma. It led to all sorts of reforms that were taking place over the next few years, even though Nicholas II managed to stay nominally in charge. So and you could also take, of course, World War I, a military defeat, and you had interesting parallels. You had all of Central Asia going up in smoke during World War I, when the Tsarist government tried to recruit them to fight in Ukraine. This is forgotten, but this led to collapse. And of course, the problem was that Kerensky and his government didn't really take advantage of this adequately and take the decisive moves that would have been called for, led to Lenin. But to return to my main theses, there are two great engines of change. One is inevitable generational shift, and the other is military collapse. Both are present in this case. We should be examining very closely the rising generation in Russia, not just the people who are visible, but the ones who are not visible. Out in the regional governments, they're there. There are several very talented younger governors in jail today. They'll all get out at a certain point. Who are these people? It doesn't mean that we should try to buy them or something like that. We should know who they are. We should know who they are now. We should be in communication with them now and be patient once the change takes place, because when they inevitably come into power, as they will, when that happens, they will bring the program with them. It won't be imposed from outside. They will know. And that'll be a very complex dynamic among them. We can shape that by expressing good intentions, but not much more. But in doing so, we can be really quite positive, quite optimistic, because exactly these two great engines of change are operative, they're unavoidable, they're unstoppable, and they will transform Russia in the coming years.
Thank you very much. I would like to continue this theme about the economic collapse and pending economic collapse in Russia. Energy experts are predicting that the budget is going to lose about 30% of its planned revenues for 2025 because of the price of oil. Different problems with OPEC that is ready to drop the price even lower. The budget is calculated at $70 per barrel. It's been much lower than that and will probably go even lower. The other thing is that Russia is apparently going to have to cut production of oil by 50%. That's what energy experts are saying because of lack of development money for new wells and because of the lack of technology. They need Western technology for development of a lot of their resources. This is just a side note to illustrate that the sanctions and the devastation of the war is significant for Russia. It's very significant for Ukraine, but it's extremely significant for Russia's economy as well. Yes, yeah.
About the oil. I served for several years as on the board of what was then, I think, the biggest or close to the biggest Russian oil company, Sedanko. I knew all the oligarchs who were fellow members of that board. My direct and indirect links with these people continue in many cases, and they are a picture of gloom. They do not see a way out of this situation.
Thank you. The gas export to Europe is down to 25%, and it will go further down because the measures of the European Union, the export of oil to Europe is under 10%, and it's going to go further down. Even Orban started talking about against Russia to one extent or another because his public is not supportive of Russia. But this is just the talk of the numbers. And what the war is causing to Russian economy and Russian infrastructure. But let me turn to Janusz Bugajski and ask him, why do you consider Russia a failed state? Is it only the economy or it's a lot more than that?
Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, great question. I actually wrote my book before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 24. And as both Paul and our previous speakers have both said, there's indications of long-term decline in many, many domains, whether it's economic, whether it's demographic, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's basically Russia's position in the global economy, its niche, which it's losing. In other words, the whole energy sector that you've talked about. So there are many, many factors there that I located as being indicators of long-term decline. In addition, internally, the system that Putin devised, which is a very personalistic authoritarianism, it doesn't even rest on the foundations of communism. Communism was more lasting. They built a structure. They built, they built something that lasted at least 3 generations. Putinism is a much more fragile, brittle system that if he fails, if he's replaced, I think the whole structure is going to come tumbling down, not just the regime, but I think the system as well. I also looked at the regions, and this is what Fred was talking about, how regional governors, I think, increasingly will look for, as they did when the Soviet Union collapsed, and not just the republics, but also the autonomous regions in Russia. We're looking towards some sort of autonomy. Many declared their sovereignty. And I can imagine a situation where a lot of these governors are going to say, well, we're not going to pay any more to Moscow because we cannot afford it. We cannot pay our pensions here. We cannot, we have to take care of our people. And at that point, and particularly if it spreads to various regions, the more regions that actually stop giving money to Moscow and start talking about, well, we have to look after our own people. In other words, the regional governors who may have been appointed by Putin suddenly turn towards their local population. I don't believe this thing that Russians are always doomed to follow the leaders. I think Russians tend to, like many people, follow the strongest. And we saw this during the mutiny 2 years ago, where there wasn't much support. I didn't see a lot of support for Putin in the streets. I saw more support for Prigozhin as they were marching towards Moscow. So the idea that Russians support Moscow always, I don't think that's true. I think if somebody can offer them resources, if somebody can offer them security, that's who they'll support. And increasingly, I think some of these regional governors and Republican leaders may be able to do that as Russia starts to weaken. There are many other factors as well, but I just mentioned a couple.
Thank you very much. There is also another factor which probably is going to contribute to a potential desire for disintegration, for independence, for more autonomy, and this is the fact that Russia repeats this story. Moscow recruited overwhelmingly people from Central Asia and Ukraine to fought World War II. Overwhelmingly from Central Asia to Central Afghanistan in the 80s. This now it's recruiting overwhelmingly among the minority nations from the North Caucasus throughout the entire Russia. The Buryats, the percentage of Buryats who were killed is just astonishing. So it always creates, as a result of that, a movement of more autonomy and more independence in those regions that have been used as they call it a blood tax in at least in some countries. It is a blood tax being paid to Moscow. So that creates the opposite movement. Away from Moscow, more independence, let's have our autonomy, let's not allow our boys to be killed in senseless wars. And I want to turn to Ilya now, because he's a representative of the Russian opposition, but not just the Russian opposition, political opposition. He believes that only armed resistance is going to achieve something in Russia. So Ilya, tell us, he wrote a very good piece for Jamestown Foundation a couple of weeks ago. Last week we published. It is available on Jamestown website, and it is about the state of the Russian opposition and what we can expect in the future from the current Russian opposition. Thank you, Ilya. Why do you think that armed resistance is the only way?
Well, if you use the word opposition, and the answer to your question is nothing. Because to me, there is opposition and there is resistance. And these are two different things. And they have different objectives, different vision, different structure, different people. And if you say opposition, so their best dream is to return to 90s and continue where it stopped with Yeltsin, because they see that Putin is the counter-revolution, which to me is not, because to me Putin is a logical continuation of what Yeltsin was doing. And we saw it with the modern Russian imperialism. It started with Chechnya in 1994. It continued. Medvedev showed the same in 2008, and it now continues the same with Putin with Ukraine. So, people change, but the methods and the approaches, they keep the same. And to me, if at the helm of the government would be just any representative of the useful, conventional for the West Russian opposition, it would still be the same. Because of what they say and how they do and what their ideals, it still would be the same. It could be softer, it could be nicer, it could be with the nice dressing, but in the foundation it would be the same. And here I wanted very much to pick up where Pani Anna has stopped in her speech, that her dream is Russia to be defeated. It was 10 days ago, there was a visit here in Washington, D.C. by Chancellor Merz. And they were sitting with President Trump, and Trump was patting him on the shoulder and saying, condolences, it's an anniversary of the D-Day, so probably it's a bad day for you. And he said, no, it's a holiday for me, because that's the day when the liberation of my country has started. So it's not about defeat of Germany or defeat of Russia. I totally share the vision that Russia Federation needs to be defeated and destroyed, because that's the oppressive state for Russians, not for any other, not only one for all other nations which surround Russia, not only for nations who are inside Russia, but it's the oppressor for Russians. And that's why it needs to be destroyed, because it's dangerous for everyone. And we are even coming to these discussions of, God forbid, nuclear war, which means just everybody is going to die. And that's the immediate threat that is being presented there. So my vision here is very simple, that this country should be gone, this regime needs to be changed, these elites need to be changed, and then the new state should be created. And all the captive nations should be let free, and those who want to go, they need to be able to go and live the way they want. Those who don't want to go should be given an option to participate in the construction of the new statehood at the principles they want. And that's as simple as that. And that's the vision of our Congress of People's Deputies and the general of the people from the arm of the opposition that I represent. To conclude, I very much wanted to comment on several previous questions. We even wrote a report which you saw, and it's available online, on the stability of Russia. To me, definitely, this state is a colossus on the clay legs. And those legs are made of clay because the right leg is called Vladimir and the left leg is called Putin. This whole statehood is deprived of all institutions, which to me was brilliantly proved when they had this democracy with Medvedev at power, but the power stayed not with the presidency, but with Putin. And the whole system inside Russia, it also has a lot of checks and balances, and the governors, and Duma, and different elites, and then the business people, and whatever. But nevertheless, it's centered on one particular person, which is the ultimate arbiter. And the good news is that this guy is mortal. So he would be gone anyway. And when people in this town are asking me, you're talking about regime change, but what we would do, a lot of risk, the next guy could be worse. I said, yeah, it would be worse, but it would happen anyway. He's gonna die. Even from natural reasons, he's gonna die. So it would be change. So we need to embrace and plan and influence so that changes would happen in the right direction. And Putin actually, by making the large-scale invasion in Ukraine, actually prompted everybody to take action. Because right now it's just dangerous to sit and to do nothing. And the first countries which started to realize this is the countries of Eastern Europe, because they are next. Poland, Baltic states, they are too close. So the threat there is at the highest. Thanks for Mr. Trump, now all other European nations, they start to wake up. Because they now understand that they have to rely on themselves. There will be no outside umbrella to protect them, which is really good. And here, obviously, the key role will be played by Germany. But just imagine, how many things have Putin done for these clay legs to collapse. It was him who facilitated the expansion of NATO. It was him who supported remilitarization of Europe. It was him who was pushing all the traditional Russian allies outside the sphere of influence, and that now they are shy to even stand up in the United Nations and vote for the resolutions that Russia suggests. So I think that this regime is very fragile, and we need to exploit the opportunity and act. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to turn to Paul Goebel again. I don't see the screen in front of me, but Paul, if there is a movement within Russia which is away from the center for more autonomy of different regions, if there is a movement for disintegration, what do you think is going to be the reaction of Moscow?
I think it's not only the question of the reaction of Moscow, but I think it's important to focus on Russian attitudes. The government and the Russian people aren't going to be thrilled by the idea that their country is going to come apart again. It's within living memory that what they conceive of as their country happened to come apart, and the ability of the current government or some future government to play on that to get people to oppose it shouldn't be underrated. At the same time, I do believe that the Russian Empire is too large to survive. I think we forget just how far away Vladivostok is from Moscow, and that I've said for some time that my own view is that the most likely developments are going to be the exodus of the peoples east of the Urals, rather than the people in the North Caucasus who get vastly more attention. I think it's distance. I think it's economic opportunity. I think the people are shifting, as Fred has suggested, looking away from Moscow to other options. And I think the question is, will the next generation, because it won't happen with Putin, but will the next generation of leaders in Russia decide that they will be better off without the burdens of empire? Because that's what happened before, when it was a decision of the Russian leadership to think that they would be better off and that the Russians would be better off without what they perceived as the ballast of the Soviet Empire that made all of that possible. And so the question is, will there be a new generation of Russians in Moscow and in the Russian regions who will decide we're all going to be better off if we don't have this ballast? Or alternatively, and I'm a little more skeptical than Fred is about the coming generation. I'm not at all sure that there won't be people in it who will be quite as enthusiastic in using force to repress any moves at liberalization which take away power that they perceive should belong to them. I hope that that happens, and I think we should be very sympathetic and supportive to the extent we can. But one of the things that I guess one sees in Russia over the last several centuries is that there's always been a great expectation for generational change, and then the changes haven't lasted or haven't been as great as people expect. I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm only saying that I think we should be cautious in assuming that whatever we do, these inevitabilities will happen. I think it matters a whole lot what we do as to where these fundamental changes that Fred has elegantly described will have an impact, how they will affect things. Because I can imagine a look at some of the Russian opposition has ended up being using vocabulary about the provinces, about the people who are far from Moscow. That's almost as ugly, and in some cases perhaps even more ugly, than some of the things coming out of the Kremlin. And I hope that we get a future Russian leadership that is not mired in the same problems. But I'm skeptical that we can just sit back and wait for this new generation to transform things in the directions we would like to see. I think Fred is absolutely right. We need to reach out to these people. We need to pay attention to them. The failure to pay attention to ethnic Russian regions, as well as many of the minorities. And if you want to see how little we're paying attention, type into Google search one of the Russian oblasts or cries, and you won't find a lot of sources listed because it's not in English, because it isn't being done. A lot more work needs to be done. And I guess my skepticism about all this is we should not assume that history is automatically going to work in our direction. I would have thought that the events after 1991 should have dispelled that assumption. But it seems to be that the end of history moment, as it were, is transmuting into another view where we're looking for those things which will take care of our problems without our having to get involved. And my own feeling, very strongly, is that unless we pay more attention, unless we get more involved, unless we think long term, and I'm very much in favor of thinking in decades, maybe not the centuries the Chinese do, but decades at least, rather than asking ourselves what will be true tomorrow. I think if we don't do that, we're going to find ourselves trapped, as I suggested at the beginning, between those who will say, let's just tear it all apart and see what happens, and then the others who will say, no, we need to keep it all together, because if we don't, China will be the biggest beneficiary.
Thank you, Paul. Would you like to add something to this question? What would be the reaction of the Russian people? What would be the reaction of Moscow? If there is disintegration, does it exclude violence, or is it possible to be peaceful? It's very, very many questions when we talk about disintegration. But I also want to ask after that a question about the impact on the neighboring states where you are a specialist.
All of the above.
All of the above.
I think we can soberly expect to see all wide range of responses.
It's not on. The microphone is not on.
Okay.
A wide range of responses geographically within Russia. Of course, and I agree with Paul on that point. It's very important to focus on real places and real people. But that said, there are commonalities, and these are recognized. And that is, anyone with a budget in any provincial city in Russia has been squeezed really badly. They know that. They know they're paying money to Moscow to pay for the war. They do so, make many out of patriotic motives, but they also know basically that their pocket is being picked, and that will absolutely impact what happens in the future. Interestingly, after Nicholas I is when you had, after the collapse of the Crimean War, that is where you had this great movement toward decentralization and self-government. It was very powerful movement, and it, by the way, it was fixed in Russian law. In the reformed Russian legal code, all the self-government, decentralization, they are there. And interestingly, Gorbachev mentioned this, spoke about this. It was still in the curriculum when he went to law school. So my point is, there's much more a basis for some kinds of reform movements that are driven by provincial leaders of a new generation than we may think. And which is all the more reason to be identifying these people. Some of them are abroad, and we should be, and through them, we should be identifying others. Some are in jail, but they are there. Now, one final point. I think we have to be clarify what happened in '91, and that is two things changed. Something called the Communist Party of the USSR ceased to exist. Unfortunately, the next day or two, it was recreated as the Communist Party of Russia. And the second thing was that what was the second thing? That's really basically it. This is a point that has been made, but is generally neglected. Everything else pretty much stayed. Oh, the USSR ceased to exist. Now, but other than those two changes, everything else continued. The entire military continued totally intact. And we see the results of that. And the entire local government system continued entirely intact. And so we have expectations. We had expectations then, which were not based on any analysis of reality. And we cannot fall into that trap today. We have to find out who are the real people. They are there. Who has studied the emigration? How many of them are going back? You know, what are their views? Where's all the writing on this? Where are our genius analysts right now? We need them. Again, there have been periods of fundamental change in Russia, and some of them endured, some of them didn't. But we are on the lip of such a period right now, and we should be opening contact, identifying and opening contact with the men and women who are going to bring it about.
Thank you, Ilya.
Yeah, just because before we move on, just with one phrase to intervene. By the way, Communist Party of USSR was recreated as United Russia, not as the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. But with this one phrase, because it is important, about violence. Now, many of our Western allies are afraid of the changes because of the possible violence. Then I'm telling them, if you avoid the change to avoid violence, you would receive both the change and the violence. And in this case, it could be negative change, not the positive change. So we need to take the risk and recognize that the only way to end this war is with the political regime change in Russia. It's not with the peace talks, it's not with the ceasefire, it's even not with the military defeat, because it would resume anyway. Only change of the regime would give security to Russia's neighbors.
Change of regime and change of the system.
Yeah, I was going
Janusz. Yeah.
In other words, not just a change of who controls the Kremlin, but a change of the structure of the country, including, as you said, those republics and regions that want to separate, for them to be able to do so. Two other factors regarding Moscow's reaction, which I think needs to be watched very carefully. One, playing up Russian ethno-nationalism, which we've seen indications of that with this Russian community structure or network against immigrants. But if that is turned against some of the local population, that could in turn spark it could actually spark movements for liberation and anti-Russian nationalisms on the territory of the country. The other point, which I think is worth making, is with military defeat, and I think Russia's now crossed the 1 million mark, if I understand, last 24 hours, over 1 million have actually, if you can imagine that, over 1 million have actually either died or been incapacitated or badly wounded. That, I mean, it's huge. And it's growing. I think in the first 3 months of this year, there was something like 150,000 already casualties. So, and this doesn't seem to be receding. I mean, the cannon fodder is still there. They can still pay them up to a point, although, as we've mentioned, I think that's going to go down. Well, the danger for Russia is also some of these veterans, servicemen coming back into the country. With weapons, with various psychological problems. There are already reports of increasing crime, family violence. They'll probably feel entitled, having served the motherland, that they should have better positions and money and respect. Question is, Moscow won't be able to afford that anymore. So what's going to happen? I envisage one potential scenario, particularly of those Buryats and Dagestanis and Sakha people, Yakuts, people coming back into the country that may gravitate towards an independence movement. In other words, if their republics, going back to what Fred was saying, and what Paul was saying, if some of these republics and regions east of the Urals decide that they want to move away from Moscow, not give Moscow the money that they're basically taking out of their pockets, stealing their resources, they may want to fund returning soldiers and militia, give them more status and prestige. And that's how you begin to build your own local defense force. in case of any danger from Moscow. Some sort of security system. It's not all necessarily chaos, in other words, that these people could be brought into a local government structure or a regional or republican structure in order to defend the autonomy, self-determination, and independence of those republics and regions.
Thank you, Janusz. And Greg wants to jump in, and then I will open for questions to the audience, and we may have some questions online.
What is irreversible? Well, I'm not going to get into that. We've had various suggestions this morning, all of them extremely interesting and provocative. I want to indicate one development, a result of this war, which is irreversible, and that is the entirety of Central Asia, plus Azerbaijan and Armenia in the Caucasus, have absolutely left the ranch. That's a fact. And they are linking arms with each other. That's a fact. They are institutionalizing it. That's a fact. That's something along the lines of ASEAN, something along the lines of the Nordic Council. This is all actually happening right now. And furthermore, this is happening with all, not just at the presidential level, but the presidents themselves are convening people in other fields and disciplines across that area. Does U.S. policy have a response to this? No. We are still fixated on this C5+1, which I had a role in bringing about. It's no longer C5, it's C6 with Azerbaijan, and who wants to join now? Mongolia. Certainly Armenia will be there. Do we have a response to this? These are wonderful positive developments that are irreversible and which have already taken place, but we, rather than being an active and conscious supporter, we're still mousing around doing trivial things on a low level and not pushing this forward as we could.
Several years ago, Central Asia didn't want to even mention the word integration. They were staying away from the word integration. Now they're talking about the union. So things have changed so dramatically, and it is true. What happens in Russia and what Russia does has an immense impact on the countries that are bordering Russia. And this is one of the most important impacts that we're witnessing now, this cooperation between Turkey, Azerbaijan. Turkmenistan opened up to this cooperation, which wasn't the case before. And this would provide for better defense of those countries if the Russian Federation starts disintegrating and there is violence, and they would be able to better protect themselves for any kind of spillover to their territories. But I'll stop here. Let's open for questions. We have a few minutes, please. Klaus. Do we have?
Yeah. Do you want to before that? I've got a spare one for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Reinhard Kutschig, I'm from Austria. Mr. Starr, you triggered a question, and this was the question about the next generation. Who could it be? I mean, we know that in 2022, 500,000 or even more young, well-educated people left the country from Russia. This was not the minorities, the captive nations, this was the Russians. And the rest of the people who lives in Russia is under control of the state, brainwashed for 25 years. And when I look back to the end of World War II, in Germany, you had people who survived Hitler. In Germany, you had people in Austria who survived Hitler. You had resistance in these countries. I don't see that in Russia, but maybe it's just missing the insight.
I don't think no one in this room or no one in the West can answer this. This is exactly the research that should have been going on and isn't. Instead, we're getting all these trivial op-eds that say nothing, and some person reads two articles and writes the third. But this is exactly where we should be doing some careful analytic work. within Russia, there's a lot of evidence of local activism of all flavors. And Goebel is right. Some of it is pretty nasty too, but it is there, and people are not sitting on their hands the way they were a couple of years ago. So these are subject to analysis. Where are our experts today? They're sitting on their hands. They're not addressing this key question of the rising generation.
Yeah, Ilya.
I think that you raised a very important question, but I think that the answer to your question lies in a different dimension. It's not a question of generation. It's not a question of age. It's the question of idea. It's the question what actually drives people, irrelevant of their age. As it was very correctly said, there is this young generation of Russians, middle-class Russians, IT guys, innovators, small business people who left Russia. Why did they go? Because they had no idea to fight for inside the country. Then there is another generation, the same generation, but another group in this generation who is now being summoned by Putin into their ranks. And maybe outside people don't notice this, but rejuvenation of the current regime actually happened throughout the last 10 years. It was justified actually with the aggression, Russian Spring, Russian Volt, and that's how Putin tried to recruit one. But in general, they're just career people who were given the opportunities because there are not so many career lifts inside the country. And finally, the government, the particular branch that was led by Sergei Kirienko, focused on actually engaging these people and bringing them inside the government. And right now, the high leadership is like Politburo. But like next to the highest level, quite top level, I am not even speaking about the middle level, right now in Russia is very young. There are a lot of youngsters who came in recently, and they are provided with training and accommodation and promotion, because that's what is happening. Now that there is a third bucket of people, those who passed through fighting at the front lines. And here where unfortunately there is a great gap between those people coming from national republics and from Russian regions. Because in the national republics, their fighting past is very easily married with the idea of the changes within these national republics. Because it was these evil Russians who forced us to fight, so that we fought, but then now we came back and we will, with the same eagerness, fight for our independence and the changes and our separate way. So they could be a progressive force. But those people from the Russian regions who are fighting back, could they be a progressive force? Again, as we saw in 1917, Bolsheviks at that time mobilized the same people who were fighting at the fronts of World War I into their benefit, but for the benefit of the change, of radical change and fighting against the Tsarism, which was progressive at the time. I'm not speaking about what happened next, but actually what happened next was fertilized by the fact who those people were. Right now, there is no idea that would be driving those people, because in the 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the only idea that was proposed by the Russian intellectuals to the Russian people was personal enrichment. And originally, by the way, it was met with enthusiasm, because people say, okay, we all will be rich. But then it turned out that it's an enrichment for the few, not for many. And that resulted in Putin coming to power at the end of the day, and resentment and all those wars. That's where the root was. And unless we are coming with the idea of a political state, inclusive state for everyone, and most likely the idea that would appeal to, firstly, working class people, which are still many, Without that, you will not be able to reform the country. You would doomed to receive the same mistake, and the only the other way to go is just a total dissolution of the country completely.
Today.
I think that we have such people who are inside Russian partisan movements. You shouldn't discount this. You know, despite it. We are in everyday argument here with our friends in Ukraine, because obviously, you know, the partisan movement in Russia is very much connected to military people in Ukraine. Otherwise, it could not exist and survive. But the question is that all military people, they want promotions for themselves, so they all claim that all the different things are done just by different military, but in fact there are like more than 10,000 people inside Russia who are fighting as resistance force. Just they are invisible, and their leaders are invisible. They would become visible in the moment of the change, not before.
Do they cooperate with Belarusians?
No, Belarusians don't want this. It's the Kalinovsky regiment inside Ukraine is very nationalistic, so like informally we are talking, but they are afraid if that would be in public that would hurt their constituents.
In Belarus?
And inside Belarus, no, because Tikhanovskaya and all this layer of people, they don't want to deal with Russians at all, because they're afraid that it would hurt their grants and Western recognition and everything, so they're keeping totally separate.
Truth is that all these operations in Russia would not have been successful without the help of the Russian resistance as well. And the reason that we're not talking too much about it, it's their safety as well. They will become visible probably one day, but for now they need to stay safe and work under the cover, so that they are not undercover, so that they are not exposed and sent to prisons. Questions?
Yeah.
Here. 1 second, I will come to you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Marina Saidukova. I am a politologist, foreign political journalist of Russia, and now I am a decolonial activist on behalf of my Buryat Mongolian nation here. Can I please first thank you, Paul Goebel, for this is a very interesting opportunity. In 2014, you translated my blog about the Russian racism, my own experience, and put it into your blog. I really do appreciate that, and thank you very much. I really hope that you're going to be here, but unfortunately you're not. So I want to thank you from 2014. And my question is actually also for you. I think we shouldn't rely on any, no matter how serious, inner force undermining Russia as a state. I think we are nations of post-Russia have to create our own reasons, independence to those objective, economical, demographic, political, or else for this mafia state to crumble. Would you think of those and don'ts for us, non-ethnically Russians, Buryat Mongols like I am, Saha, Chechen, Tatar, and all the rest, to create and develop those reasons to avoid the situation when we will seek the permission from whatever new Moscow's political elite to success, but to create a totally new situation when we will allow us to take ourselves regardless of what Moscow will think. We're trying to wake up our people. It's really hard because they are brainwashed on a regular, like everyday basis. They're under the strong political and economical pressure. But we are really, really trying, and I really want you, as the person who dedicated 30 years of your life, looking at us, our development, our low and high moments in history. What do you think? Thank you.
Okay, I can jump in. Thank you for your kind words. I would suggest that that we may very well say that Moscow is doing more to destroy the Russian Federation than any of us are ever going to be able to do. a week ago, an event happened in Moscow with Mr. Putin making a major speech that got absolutely no attention in the Western media, but probably tells you exactly why that's so. He is now pursuing a Russian nationalist agenda in a multinational country. And that Russian nationalist vision that he has is so narrow that it is not only going to alienate far more than anything the West could do, the non-Russian peoples of the Russian Federation, but large numbers of Russian regionalists, people who are the difference between being a Russian in Vladivostok and a Russian in Moscow is so big that we need to remember that the British Empire began by falling apart mostly from areas that spoke English. The same thing, I think, will happen in the case of the Russian Federation. My sense is that what Mr. Putin is doing is the worst possible mistake he's made since February 22, and that is to try to save his regime by promoting a Russian nationalism and his open support of the Russian community, which is a Kremlin project, not a project from below, or can't simply be blamed on the Orthodox Church, and that is going to tear the country apart more in the coming weeks and months than almost anything else. I think I'm delighted to have a chance to mention Russian nationalism, because one of the things that happens when we talk about non-Russian activism is that we ignore that Russians respond, and they respond by their own version of nationalism. And what Mr. Putin has done, instead of pushing Russians in the direction of a sense of identity that would allow them to keep the place together or even grow, but rather will guarantee that it falls apart, and not just along ethnic lines. In fact, those may not, in my view, be the most important, but rather on regional lines as well, especially east of the Urals.
Thank you, Paul. And we have the last question.
Thank you very much. My question would be regarding the role of OTC. My name is Nurul Rakimbek, and I represent Center for Global Civic and Political Strategies, DC-based think tank. Originally from Kazakhstan, of course, these issues are very interesting. We will research sanctions evasion processes also, how the country evades sanctions, Russian sanctions, basically, how they help. What I'm interested in is it's very fascinating. Thank you very much for covering many areas. What's interesting for me is also to see, recently we've observed in media, there was a lot of cultural also exchange. There was a music, I think Bashkir group, they've made like Ayola group, they made a very popular single which sort of raised moods of Turkic people like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. So I don't know, like with this OTC organization of Turkic countries, what's the role? I mean, are they going to be like really helping in that direction, or what is it about? What do you think?
Well, the best person to answer is Fred Starr, of course.
It's useful. It's useful, but we can't have any illusions. This is ethnic project. This is Erdogan's ethnic project. And therefore it excludes not only Tajiks, but half of Uzbeks. It excludes Afghanistan. I think we should welcome it as a force decentralizing the former Soviet space, but it is absolutely not a substitute for a Central Asia Union a greater Central Asia Union that they must form themselves, and that will never be done from outside and shouldn't be done from outside.
Thank you. Thank you. Janusz, do you want to say anything at the end?
No, not really. Well, maybe just a book. Maybe just a book.
Yes.
This
This has just been published. We just received limited copies from London. It was going to be published in Kyiv, but they have paper shortages at times. So we published it in England. We have a few copies available. We want to give them to all the speakers and a few journalists that will be able to cover it, write about it. Basically, what it is a compendium of the first 14 forums. Oleg is here, is photographed in the book. Oleg was the founder of the Free Nations Forum. Anna was instrumental, Anna Fotyga was instrumental in launching it in Poland, in Warsaw, a couple of years ago, more than a couple of years ago. So this is a compilation of the 14 fora, all the major speeches, and also very important, I think, is the listing that we have of all the organizations. Fred said how it isn't covered. Well, a lot of this is covered in here. Many, of course, these organizations exist in exile, but they have contacts with their motherland, with their countries, with the republics, familial contacts, NGO contacts, and so on and so forth, media contacts. So this is probably the best source now at this point, this first anthology, the best source of information about what faces Russia and the kind of resistance, not just opposition, that the Russian regime, the Russian system faces. And hopefully we'll have more anthologies in the future. As I said, only a few copies available, but if you go to the Jamestown website, I've just started a new project called Neo-Prometheism. I won't go into it now, but on that page on the website, you'll be able to get access to the book, and I think PDFs are also available for those that can't purchase. So on that note, that's all I have to say.
Very quick.
Yes.
We've had extremely interesting statements here and from you all as well, and it's very valuable. However, you cannot listen to this discussion and hear what you all are doing and not realize that there is a huge deficit of research. Huge. And not only is the research not being done on many key issues, but where it is being done, it doesn't get into the bloodstream because it's being published in squirrely places that people in the larger community don't read. And so I think it's all very nice to have conversations like this, but until this entire discussion gets out into the larger world, you're still going to have lots of people in this country absolutely deluded on all this and ill-informed, and people speaking very prominently, publishing very prominently. So frankly, the biggest problem that's revealed here this morning is our failure to be on top of these developments. Hats off to what you're doing. But a larger failure is that the so-called analytic community has failed either to bring the information together or to communicate it in a convincing way to the educated public.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. This was a fascinating panel. The discussion was great, and I'm sure there will be projects coming out of this discussion. There is a lot to be done, and you're absolutely right. Proper investigation of who is who and who is doing what, and what the people of Russia want for their future is absolutely essential. And those future leaders are going to be among them. We had this in Eastern Europe during the last years of communism. We had Radio Free Europe interviewing all these dissidents and all these future leaders that became leaders of the new democratic movement after that. Now we have closure of Voice of America, closure of RFERL, closure of some agencies that were doing more direct work, and particularly with democracy organizations doing work on the ground, and that's going to be impeded, which makes it even more compelling for the analytical community to work on the topic. Russia is not invincible. This is the first the first conclusion that needs to be distributed, needs to reach the wider public. Secondly, Russian people are not one people, they're many peoples, and they do want a different futures for themselves. And that's the second one that larger Western publics do not understand. Along with the fact that Russia is still an empire, and this is how it should be treated, and any policy should be devised from that point of view. It's not going to be it's not going to be a collapse or transformation like any other country in Eastern Europe. It's going to be a completely different transformation, and that's where the policy should start. Thank you all. We're going to have a quick break, 10 minutes for coffee, and we're going to start with the next two panels to hear the voices of people of Russia. Thank you.